At exactly 5:30 every morning, before the first customers arrived, an old man quietly unlocked the side entrance of Hamilton National Bank. His name was Arthur Bennett. He was 82 years old. His gray hair had almost turned white. Deep wrinkles covered his face, and arthritis made every step painful. Yet no matter how much his knees hurt, Arthur never complained. He simply picked up his worn mop, filled his bucket with warm water, and began cleaning the marble floors that reflected the wealth of people who barely noticed him. For 38 years, Arthur had worked as the bank's janitor. Thousands of customers had walked past him. Hundreds of employees had greeted him with polite smiles. But very few people knew his name. To most of them, he was simply the old janitor. Every evening, he returned to a tiny apartment on the edge of the city. The building was old. The roof leaked whenever it rained. The elevator hadn't worked in years. Arthur climbed 4 flights of stairs every night, leaning on the rusty railing. His neighbors often asked why he still worked at his age. He always smiled. "As long as these old hands can still move," he would say softly, "I'll earn my own bread." No one knew the real reason. Hidden inside a small wooden box beneath his bed were dozens of hospital bills. Every one of them belonged to Emma Carter, a 12-year-old girl battling a rare heart disease. Emma wasn't related to Arthur. She had simply become his family. 3 years earlier, Arthur had found her sitting alone outside a charity hospital after her mother had died. Her father had passed away years before. She had no grandparents, no brothers, no sisters, just a frightened little girl with nowhere to go. Arthur had never been wealthy, but he couldn't leave her alone. He visited her every day. He paid for her school supplies. He celebrated every birthday. He read stories beside her hospital bed. Emma called him Grandpa. Arthur called her his miracle. Then, 2 weeks earlier, the doctors delivered devastating news. Without an experimental surgery available only overseas, Emma had less than 6 months to live. The surgery cost $5 million. Arthur sold everything he owned: his old pickup truck, his late wife's wedding ring, the tiny collection of antique watches he had spent decades restoring. Still, he gathered less than $40,000. Every charity he contacted apologized. Every investor refused. Then Arthur remembered something. For nearly 4 decades, he had faithfully served Hamilton National Bank. Surely someone there would at least listen. The following Monday morning, Arthur did something he had never done before. Instead of changing into his blue janitor's uniform, he wore his only suit. It was 25 years old. The sleeves were slightly short. The fabric had faded, but he carefully ironed every crease. Emma smiled from her hospital bed. "You look handsome, Grandpa." Arthur laughed gently. "I have an important meeting today." "Will they help us?" He hesitated. "I hope they remember that kindness still exists." Emma reached into her backpack and handed him a tiny folded paper crane. "For good luck." Arthur carefully placed it inside his jacket pocket. "I'll bring back good news." He kissed her forehead and left. Inside Hamilton National Bank, employees immediately noticed him. What happened to Arthur? Why is the janitor wearing a suit? Did someone die? Arthur ignored the whispers. He approached the reception desk. "I'd like to speak with the loan department." The young receptionist looked confused. "Do you have an appointment?" "No." "What kind of loan?" Arthur swallowed. $5 million. The receptionist blinked. "I'm sorry. Did you say 5,000? "No, 5 million. The smile disappeared from her face. Several nearby employees overheard the conversation. Someone chuckled. Another laughed louder. Within seconds, the whisper spread across the lobby. "The janitor wants $5 million. Has he lost his mind? This has to be a joke." Arthur stood quietly. He wasn't embarrassed. Not yet. The receptionist nervously called the branch manager. Minutes later, Richard Collins, the bank manager, walked into the lobby. Expensive Italian suit, gold watch, perfect smile. He had worked at Hamilton National Bank for only 6 years, but acted as though he owned the building. "Arthur." Richard smiled coldly. "What seems to be the problem?" Arthur spoke politely. "I need a loan." Richard nodded. "For how much?" Arthur took a deep breath. $5 million. Silence. Then laughter exploded throughout the lobby. Customers turned around. Employees covered their mouths, trying and failing to hide their amusement. Richard laughed harder than anyone. Arthur, do you even know what $5 million looks like? Arthur remained calm. I know exactly what it means. Richard crossed his arms. And your collateral? My honesty. More laughter. My years of service. Even louder laughter. My word. One executive walking through the lobby whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. His mop is probably worth more than his credit score. The crowd burst into laughter again. Arthur's cheeks turned red. Still, he refused to lower his head. Richard finally stopped laughing. Arthur, you've cleaned our floors for decades. Yes. But don't confuse kindness with charity. I am asking for a loan. Based on what? Arthur quietly replied, based on trust. Richard shook his head. This bank deals with assets, not fairy tales. Then he snapped his fingers toward security. I think it's time our janitor got back to work. The two security guards hesitated. Everyone knew Arthur. Everyone respected him. But orders were orders. One guard gently touched Arthur's shoulder. I'm sorry. Arthur slowly picked up his old leather briefcase. It looked ancient. The corners were cracked. One clasp barely closed. As he turned to leave, the worn briefcase slipped from his trembling hands. It hit the marble floor with a loud thud. The latch broke open. Old photographs scattered across the lobby. Yellowed letters fluttered through the air. Customers instinctively stepped back. One brittle envelope slid across the polished floor and stopped at the expensive shoes of Richard Collins. Annoyed, Richard bent down to pick it up. His eyes casually glanced at the faded handwriting. Then, his smile disappeared. His face turned pale. His hands began to shake. Because written across the front of that forgotten envelope were 6 words he had never expected to see again. Property of Jonathan Hamilton. Richard Collins stared at the faded envelope as though it had become a ghost from another lifetime. His confident smile vanished. The color drained from his face. His fingers trembled so violently that the envelope nearly slipped from his hand. For several long seconds, the busy lobby of Hamilton National Bank became strangely quiet. Arthur Bennett noticed a sudden change. Just a moment ago, everyone had been laughing. Now the bank manager looked as if he had seen something impossible. Richard quickly regained his composure, forcing a smile. It's just an old envelope. But his voice betrayed him. Arthur slowly walked toward him. It belongs to me. Richard tightened his grip. Where did you get this? Arthur frowned. It has been in my possession for more than 40 years. Richard's heartbeat raced. 40 years. That wasn't possible. Jonathan Hamilton's personal records had disappeared decades ago. Every file, every photograph, every letter, everything connected to that time was supposed to have been destroyed. Richard handed the envelope back, pretending it meant nothing. You should leave now. Arthur carefully placed it inside his worn briefcase. I only came to ask for help. Richard looked away. I'm afraid we can't help you. Arthur nodded sadly. I understand. Without another word, the 82-year-old man slowly walked toward the exit. The laughter had disappeared. Even the employees who had mocked him moments earlier avoided looking into his eyes. Something about that old envelope had changed the atmosphere. Arthur quietly left the bank. The automatic doors closed behind him. The moment he disappeared from sight, Richard turned sharply toward his assistant. Close my office door. 5 minutes later, 4 senior executives sat around a polished conference table. Richard placed the envelope on the table. No one spoke. Finally, the oldest executive whispered, Where did this come from? The janitor. Silence. Another executive laughed nervously. You're joking. I wish I were. He pointed toward the faded handwriting. Read it. The room fell silent again. One executive slowly leaned back in his chair. I haven't seen Jonathan Hamilton's signature since. He couldn't finish the sentence, because everyone in that room knew the story. Officially, Jonathan Hamilton had died in a boating accident 42 years earlier. The newspapers called it tragedy. The police called it an accident. The bank called it the beginning of a new era, but behind closed doors, some people had always known the truth wasn't so simple. Richard lowered his voice. Find out everything about Arthur Bennett. I want his employment records, his family, his friends. I even want to know what he eats for breakfast. One executive asked nervously, what if he knows? Richard slammed his hand onto the table. He can't know. If that envelope contains what I think it does. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Everyone understood. Meanwhile, Arthur walked several blocks through the cold afternoon. His shoulders felt heavier than ever. He had expected rejection, but he hadn't expected humiliation. He stopped outside a small bakery. Through the window, he saw children laughing while choosing pastries. For a brief moment, he remembered another little girl, his own daughter, Lily. 45 years earlier, she had loved cinnamon rolls. She would press her tiny hands against the bakery window until Arthur finally laughed and bought one. But Lily never grew up. She died at 8 years old after a drunk driver ran a red light. His wife, Margaret, never recovered from the loss. Within 5 years, illness claimed her too. Arthur buried both of them with his own hands. After that, his house became unbearably quiet, until Emma entered his life. She didn't replace his family. She reminded him that his heart still had room to love. Arthur entered the hospital carrying a small paper bag. Inside were Emma's favorite chocolate cookies. The nurse smiled. She's been waiting for you. Emma's face lit up the moment she saw him. So, Arthur forced a smile. They're thinking about it. Emma knew he wasn't telling the whole truth, but she smiled anyway. I knew they'd help. Arthur gently squeezed her hand. I'll never stop trying. That evening, after Emma fell asleep, Arthur returned to his apartment. Rain tapped softly against the windows. He sat on the edge of his bed and opened the old leather briefcase. Inside were dozens of yellow documents, old photographs, letters, receipts, and at the very bottom, the faded envelope. Arthur carefully opened it. Inside was a folded document with Jonathan Hamilton's signature. He smiled sadly. I wish you were still here, my friend. A flashback filled his mind. 42 years earlier, Arthur wasn't a janitor. He was 20 years old, strong, confident, working as a maintenance technician during the construction of Hamilton National Bank's new headquarters. Jonathan Hamilton, the bank's founder, often walked to a construction site without bodyguards. Unlike wealthy businessmen, Jonathan knew every worker by name. He ate lunch beside carpenters. He shook hands with electricians. He even carried bricks when workers fell behind schedule. One rainy evening, Jonathan slipped from a steel platform. Arthur caught him just before he fell 3 stories. That single act created an unlikely friendship. Jonathan never forgot it. Over the following years, he often invited Arthur into his office, not as an employee, as a trusted friend. One night, Jonathan looked unusually worried. If anything ever happens to me, he handed Arthur the very envelope now resting on the bed. Promise me you'll protect this. Arthur had frowned. What is it? Jonathan smiled sadly. Proof. Proof of what? The truth. Arthur had wanted to ask more questions, but Jonathan simply said, if I disappear before the right time comes, don't open it unless justice demands it. Arthur had kept that promise. For 42 years, he never opened the sealed document. Not once. Not even after Jonathan's mysterious death. Arthur gently touched the envelope. Maybe, he whispered, maybe the right time has finally come. Just then, someone knocked on his apartment door. It was nearly midnight. Arthur wasn't expecting anyone. He slowly stood, walked to the door, and opened it. Standing outside were 2 men in expensive black suits. Neither smiled. One of them spoke in a cold, measured voice. Mr. Arthur Bennett? Yes. We'd like to buy that envelope. Arthur frowned. I'm not selling anything. The second man reached into his jacket and placed a thick bundle of cash on the small hallway table. $1 million. Arthur stared at the money, then quietly looked back at the strangers. I'm sorry. It's not for sale. The taller man stepped closer. His smile disappeared. You don't understand. This is an offer. It's your last chance. Arthur's eyes narrowed. For the first time in decades, he realized a forgotten document in his possession wasn't just old paper. It was something powerful enough to make wealthy men appear at his door in the middle of the night, and powerful enough to make them desperate. Arthur Bennett stood silently in the doorway, staring at the two well-dressed strangers. The hallway outside his apartment was dimly lit, and a heavy rain drummed against the old windows. Between them sat a black leather briefcase filled with neatly stacked bundles of cash. $1 million, the taller man repeated. Take the money. Give us the envelope. We all walk away happy. Arthur looked at the money, then back at the strangers. After a long pause, he quietly answered, When I was young, I promised a good man that I would protect something important. I have kept that promise for 42 years. I'm not breaking it tonight. The shorter man sighed impatiently. You have no idea what you're holding. Arthur's eyes remained calm. No, but I know why you're afraid of it. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then the taller one stepped closer. You have until tomorrow morning. After that, we can't guarantee your safety or the little girl you've been visiting at St. Mary's Children's Hospital. Arthur's heart nearly stopped. Leave Emma out of this. So you do care about someone. The stranger smiled coldly before both men turned and disappeared down the staircase. Arthur locked the door immediately. His hands shook, not because of the threat against him, but because they knew about Emma. That meant someone had been watching him. For the first time in decades, Arthur realized this was no longer about an old promise. Someone powerful was willing to hurt an innocent child. He walked to his bedroom, removed the faded envelope from the wooden box beneath his bed, and placed it carefully on the table. He stared at Jonathan Hamilton's handwriting. 42 years ago, Jonathan had said only one sentence. Don't open it unless justice demands it. Arthur closed his eyes. I've kept my promise, Jonathan. He carefully broke the old wax seal. Inside were several documents, their edges yellow with age. The first page was a handwritten letter. Arthur unfolded it slowly. To my friend, Arthur Bennett, if you are reading this, then I was right to fear the people closest to me. I believe my life is in danger. The men sitting beside me in the boardroom are not building this bank. They are stealing it. If I disappear, do not believe anyone who calls an accident. Arthur's breathing became heavier. He continued reading. Inside this envelope are copies of contracts, ownership records, and signed confessions proving that millions of dollars were stolen from innocent families. They forged my signature. They created fake companies. They bribed officials. Worst of all, they planned to remove me if I refused to cooperate. Arthur turned the page. There were bank records, property transfers, secret account numbers. Each carried Jonathan Hamilton's signature and handwritten notes. Then one photograph slipped onto the floor. Arthur picked it up. It showed Jonathan standing beside 3 smiling executives during the bank's grand opening. Arthur recognized only one face. Although younger, there was no mistake. It was William Collins, Richard Collins' father. Arthur's eyes widened. So that's why... He suddenly understood Richard's terrified reaction in the bank lobby. This wasn't just history. It was family. Another folded sheet caught his attention. At the bottom was a handwritten sentence. If my children cannot save this bank, perhaps history will. Arthur, I trust you more than anyone. Tears filled Arthur's eyes. Jonathan had believed in him all those years ago. Now the responsibility rested entirely on his shoulders. Just then, Arthur's phone rang. It was the hospital. His heart raced. Mr. Bennett? The nurse asked urgently. Emma is stable, but someone came asking questions about her this evening. Arthur gripped the phone tightly. What kind of questions? They claimed to be relatives, but Emma said she'd never seen them before. Security asked them to leave. Arthur felt a chill run through his body. The threats were already becoming real. I'll be there immediately. Across town, inside the executive boardroom of Hamilton National Bank, Richard Collins slammed his fist onto the polished table. Did you get the envelope? The taller stranger lowered his head. He refused. Richard cursed under his breath. I told you failure was an option. He opened it. Silence filled the room. Richard's face turned white. He what? He opened it after we left. Richard slowly sat down. Everything his father had spent decades hiding, everything the bank had buried, everything that made them wealthy, could now be exposed. One elderly board member whispered nervously, if those documents reach the authorities, we're finished. Richard looked toward the city skyline through the large glass window. No, he said quietly. Not if we find Arthur Bennett first. Meanwhile, Arthur arrived at the hospital just after midnight. Emma was asleep, holding the small paper crane he had carried in his pocket only hours earlier. He gently brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. I made you a promise, he whispered. I'm going to save you. Then he looked at Jonathan Hamilton's envelope tucked safely inside his coat. Arthur had walked into bank, hoping to borrow $5 million. Instead, he had uncovered evidence capable of destroying one of the most powerful financial empires in the country. Outside the hospital, across the street, a black SUV quietly parked beneath a streetlight. Inside, Richard Collins watched the hospital entrance through binoculars. He lowered them slowly. Then he gave a single, chilling order. Tomorrow morning, Arthur Bennett disappears. He remained in the hospital beside Emma's bed until sunrise, listening to the steady rhythm of the heart monitor. Every beat reminded him why he couldn't give up. This fight was no longer just about an old promise to Jonathan Hamilton. It was about protecting the only family he had left. As the first rays of sunlight entered the room, Emma slowly opened her eyes. You didn't go home, Grandpa. Arthur smiled warmly. I wanted to make sure my favorite girl was safe. Emma noticed a worry in his eyes. Something happened, didn't it? Arthur hesitated before nodding. I found something that some very powerful people don't want anyone to see. Emma reached for his hand. You always tell me that the truth wins in the end. Arthur smiled through moist eyes. Yes, and today I have to believe my own advice. Across town, Hamilton National Bank was in chaos. Richard Collins had called an emergency meeting before the bank even opened. Every executive looked nervous. Some were pacing. Others were checking their phones every few seconds. Richard stood at the head of the table. We have one objective. He looked each executive in the eye. Find Arthur Bennett before he reaches the police or the press. One board member cleared his throat. What if the documents have already been copied? Richard's expression darkened. Then we recover every copy. And if we can't? Richard answered coldly. Then we destroy Arthur's credibility. The room fell silent. One executive whispered, How? Richard smiled. We tell the world he's an old man suffering from dementia. Several executives exchanged uneasy glances. It'll work, Richard continued. Who's going to believe an 82-year-old janitor over one of the most respected banks in the country? No one argued. Meanwhile, Arthur left the hospital through a side entrance. He had noticed the same black SUV parked across the street twice during the night. Someone was watching him. Instead of walking toward the bus stop, he turned into a crowded public market. He moved slowly between fruit stands and coffee shops until he was certain no one was directly behind him. Then he entered a small law office tucked between two old buildings. The sign above the door read, Margaret Hayes, attorney at law. Margaret Hayes was 74 years old and had been Jonathan Hamilton's personal attorney decades earlier. Arthur hadn't seen her in over 30 years. When her assistant announced his name, Margaret hurried into the reception area. The moment she saw him, tears filled her eyes. Arthur, it's really you. Arthur smiled sadly. It's been a long time. She noticed the old envelope in his hands. Her expression immediately changed. You opened it. Arthur nodded. I had no choice. Margaret quietly locked her office door. I always prayed that day would never come. Arthur placed the documents on her desk. As she read the first page, her hands began to tremble. My God! I thought Jonathan's evidence had been destroyed. Arthur looked at her. So it was all true? Margaret slowly nodded. Worse than you can imagine. She opened an old filing cabinet and removed several dusty folders. For 42 years, I've kept copies of legal records everyone believed were missing. Arthur looked surprised. You kept them? I promised Jonathan I would. She placed the files beside his documents. They fit together perfectly. Arthur carefully examined the papers. Hidden among them was a notarized agreement proving that Jonathan Hamilton had owned 80% of the bank when he died. According to the official records, however, he had owned less than 20%. Someone had forged the documents. Someone had stolen the bank itself. Margaret looked directly at Arthur. This isn't just financial fraud. It's corporate theft, forgery, conspiracy, and possibly murder. Arthur remained silent. Jonathan hadn't simply lost his company. Someone had erased his legacy. At that very moment, Richard Collins received a phone call. "We found him." Richard stood immediately. "Where?" "Margaret Hayes' law office." Richard's jaw tightened. "Don't let him leave." Back inside the law office, Margaret made a decision. "We're not taking these documents to the local police." Arthur frowned. "Why not?" "Because some of them worked with your enemies years ago." Arthur felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "Then who can we trust?" Margaret reached for her phone. "I know someone." She dialed a number from memory. After a few moments, a calm voice answered. "This is Special Agent Daniel Brooks with the Federal Financial Crimes Division." Margaret took a deep breath. "Daniel, this is Margaret Hayes. I believe I have evidence proving the largest banking conspiracy this city has ever seen." There was silence on the other end. Then Agent Brooks replied, "I'm coming personally." Less than 5 minutes later, Arthur glanced through the office window. His heart skipped a beat. 3 black SUVs had quietly surrounded the building. Men in dark suits stepped onto the sidewalk. They weren't police. They weren't federal agents. And they weren't there to talk. Richard Collins climbed out of the last SUV. He straightened his expensive suit and looked directly toward Margaret's office window. Then, with a cold smile, he raised one finger and pointed straight at Arthur. Margaret saw him too. Her face turned pale. "They're here." Arthur carefully gathered Jonathan Hamilton's documents and slipped them back into the old leather briefcase. Richard Collins began walking toward the office entrance. Behind him, 6 men followed. The receptionist looked up nervously as the front door swung open. Richard's voice echoed through the building. "Arthur Bennett, you've made a very expensive mistake." Arthur took a slow breath. For the first time in 42 years, the quiet old janitor was no longer running from the truth. He was ready to fight for it. Richard Collins pushed open the office door with the confidence of a man who had never been told no. Behind him, 6 men in dark suits spread throughout the reception area, blocking every exit. The receptionist shrank back in fear. Margaret Hayes stepped out of her office before Richard could say another word. "You have no legal right to be here," she said firmly. Richard smiled. "I've only come to speak with an old employee." Arthur Bennett walked into the hallway, his worn leather briefcase in one hand. "You've already said enough to me," Arthur replied calmly. Richard's smile disappeared. "Mr. Bennett, you're confused. Those papers belong to Hamilton National Bank." Arthur shook his head. "They belong to the truth." Richard took another step forward. "Name your price." Arthur didn't answer. $5 million? Richard continued. 10 million? 20. Margaret stared at him in disbelief. "So you're admitting the documents are real?" Richard immediately realized his mistake. But it was too late. Arthur quietly smiled. "For a man who claims they're worthless, you're willing to spend a fortune to get them back." Richard's face hardened. "I'm done negotiating." He nodded toward one of the men behind him. The large man moved toward Arthur. Before he could reach him, "Federal agents." Nobody moved. The office door burst open. Half a dozen armed agents rushed inside, wearing jackets marked Federal Financial Crimes Division. Leading them was Special Agent Daniel Brooks. His sharp eyes swept across the room before stopping on Richard Collins. "Mr. Collins," Brooks said. "Interesting place for an executive board meeting." Richard forced a nervous laugh. "There must be some misunderstanding." "I don't think so." Agent Brooks held up a search warrant. "We've been investigating suspicious financial transfers connected to Hamilton National Bank for the past 18 months. Richard's smile slowly faded. "And thanks to Mr. Bennett." He looked toward Arthur. "We finally know where to look." Arthur carefully handed the old leather briefcase to Agent Brooks. "These belong to Jonathan Hamilton." Brooks accepted it with both hands. He opened the case and slowly examined the documents. His expression changed with every page. Property records, forged signatures, secret offshore accounts, board meeting minutes, handwritten confessions. Finally, Brooks unfolded the last document. His eyes widened. "My God!" Margaret quietly asked, "What is it?" Brooks looked directly at Richard. "This isn't just evidence of financial fraud." He placed the paper on the table. "It's Jonathan Hamilton's original statement naming the people responsible if anything happened to him." The room fell silent. Richard's name wasn't listed, but one name stood at the top: William Collins, Richard's late father, the founder's closest business partner, the man celebrated for saving Hamilton National Bank after Jonathan's death. Brooks looked back at Richard. "Your father orchestrated the theft of the bank." Richard's shoulders slumped. For the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. Within hours, federal investigators surrounded Hamilton National Bank. News helicopters circled overhead. Television crews filled the streets. Customers gathered behind police barricades, watching stunned as agents carried boxes of financial records from the building. The story spread across every news channel. 42-year banking conspiracy exposed. 82-year-old janitor uncovers historic fraud. Hidden documents rewrite city's history. Employees who had laughed at Arthur the day before now watched in shame. Some lowered their heads. Others quietly cried. The security guard who had escorted Arthur from the lobby approached him outside the bank. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I should have stood up for you." Arthur placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You were only doing your job." The guard wiped away tears. "No, I forgot to do what was right." Arthur smiled kindly. "It's never too late." Late that afternoon, Agent Brooks approached Arthur with another piece of news. "We confirmed everything." Arthur looked at him quietly. "The forged ownership records are being overturned. The bank will return to Jonathan Hamilton's legal estate." Arthur nodded. That's what he wanted. Brooks smiled. "There's more." The Hamilton Foundation, which Jonathan secretly established decades ago, becomes active again once the original ownership is restored. Arthur frowned. "I've never heard of it." "Almost no one has." Brooks handed him a folder. Inside was Jonathan's final instruction. "If justice is ever restored, the Foundation's first purpose shall be helping sick children whose families cannot afford life-saving treatment." Arthur's hands began to shake. His eyes filled with tears. Emma. Jonathan had thought of children like Emma more than 4 decades ago. Brooks smiled warmly. "The Foundation currently controls assets worth over $600 million. Arthur looked up slowly. "What does that mean?" "It means," Brooks replied, "Emma's surgery will be fully funded." Arthur closed his eyes. For the first time since her diagnosis, he allowed himself to cry. Not because of revenge, not because the corrupt executives had fallen, but because a little girl would get the chance to grow up. As television cameras captured the emotional moment, people across the city watched the old janitor quietly whisper one sentence to the sky. "Thank you, Jonathan." Far above the crowded street, the church bells began to ring. But while justice had finally begun, one shocking secret about Jonathan Hamilton's death still remained buried. And before the truth could set everyone free, someone from the past was about to walk back into Arthur Bennett's life with a confession that would leave the entire city speechless. 3 days after Hamilton National Bank collapsed into scandal, the city looked different. Newspapers lined every street corner with Arthur Bennett's photograph on the front page. The headlines called him a hero, the janitor who saved the city. Television reporters waited outside his apartment. People who had never spoken to him before now wanted interviews. Companies offered him money to tell his story. Arthur politely declined every offer. "I didn't do it for fame," he always said. "I did it because a promise is meant to be kept." Meanwhile, federal investigators continued searching through thousands of old records recovered from the bank. Late one afternoon, Special Agent Daniel Brooks received a phone call. "Agent Brooks," a young investigator said excitedly, "we found someone." "Who?" "The former personal driver of Jonathan Hamilton." The man was 91 years old. His name was Samuel Reed. For more than 4 decades, Samuel had remained silent, believing no one would ever believe his story. Now, with the evidence Arthur had uncovered, he was finally ready to speak. The next morning, Arthur, Margaret Hayes, and Agent Brooks visited Samuel at a small retirement home overlooking a quiet lake. Samuel struggled to stand when Arthur entered, his eyes filled with tears. "I've waited 42 years to meet you." Arthur gently shook his hand. "You knew Jonathan?" Samuel nodded. "He trusted both of us." The room became silent. Samuel reached beneath an old blanket and pulled out a rusted metal box. "I've carried this since the day he died." Inside was a small cassette recorder. Alongside it lay Jonathan Hamilton's wristwatch. Samuel carefully handed the recorder to Agent Brooks. "I couldn't save him," he whispered, "but maybe this can—" Back at the federal office, technicians restored the aging cassette. Everyone gathered around the speakers. Arthur's heart pounded. Then Jonathan Hamilton's voice filled the room. Clear, calm, unmistakable. "If you're hearing this recording, then I was right." Arthur lowered his head. It felt as though his old friend had returned one last time. Jonathan continued, "I have discovered that members of my own board intend to steal this bank. They have forged documents, bribed officials, and threatened my family." The room remained perfectly still. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "If anything happens to me, it will not be an accident." Silence. Several investigators wiped tears from their eyes. The recording continued. "I leave my legacy not to the richest people, but to the most honest ones. Wealth without character destroys families. Kindness builds generations." The tape ended with a soft click. No one spoke for nearly a minute. The mystery that had haunted the city for 42 years was finally over. Jonathan Hamilton had told the truth. Within weeks, the courts officially declared Jonathan Hamilton's death the result of a criminal conspiracy. Every fraudulent transfer was reversed. The remaining executives were arrested. Properties worth hundreds of millions of dollars were seized. Families who had lost their savings decades earlier began receiving compensation through the restored Hamilton Foundation. For many elderly victims, it was the first justice they had seen in their lifetime. 1 month later, Emma underwent her life-saving heart surgery. Arthur sat outside the operating room for nearly 8 hours. His hands never stopped trembling. When the surgeon finally stepped into the hallway, Arthur immediately stood. The doctor smiled. The surgery was a complete success. Arthur covered his face with both hands. Years of loneliness, months of fear, weeks of uncertainty, all melted into tears of relief. Emma was going to live. Several days later, Emma was discharged from the hospital. As they walked outside together, hundreds of people waited. Doctors, nurses, former bank employees, construction workers, teachers, children, even the security guard who had once escorted Arthur from the bank stood in the front row. Someone began clapping. Then another. Soon the entire crowd applauded. Arthur looked embarrassed. "I don't deserve this." An elderly woman stepped forward. "You reminded us that dignity doesn't come from money." Another man said, "You taught us never to judge someone by their clothes." The security guard approached Arthur with tears in his eyes. "I'll never forget how kindly you forgave me." Arthur smiled gently. Forgiveness is lighter to carry than hatred. Emma slipped her small hand into Arthur's. "You told me kindness always wins." Arthur looked at the smiling faces around him. "It doesn't always win quickly," he replied. "But if you refuse to give up, it wins in the end." 6 months later, the grand reopening of Hamilton National Bank took place. The bank had been transformed into a nonprofit community institution with a mission of supporting small businesses, scholarships, and children's medical care through the Hamilton Foundation. At the entrance, workers unveiled a bronze statue. It wasn't of a wealthy banker. It wasn't of a politician. It was of an elderly man holding a mop in one hand and a worn leather briefcase in the other. The plaque beneath the statue read, "Arthur Bennett, 1944. He proved that integrity is worth more than fortune, courage is stronger than power, and one honest man can change the destiny of an entire city." Arthur quietly looked at the statue, then at Emma, who was laughing as she chased pigeons across the plaza. He reached into his coat pocket and unfolded the tiny paper crane she had given him on the morning. He walked into the bank asking for a $5 million loan. It was slightly wrinkled now, but still whole. He smiled toward the sky. "I kept my promise, Jonathan." A gentle breeze carried the paper crane from his hand. It rose above the crowd, soaring into the bright blue sky as church bells rang across the city. And for the first time in 42 years, Arthur Bennett felt something he had almost forgotten: peace.